Well, good morning, and I'm going to use the podium rather than kind of roam around just because I have a couple of notes that I want to make sure that I touch on. It's a great pleasure to be here and to share some observations, and thank you to the Academy and Management Concepts for the opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes about what we see in GAO as some of the big human capital challenges that we currently confront, as well as some of those that are on the horizon, or I shouldn't even say on the horizon, that agencies are already beginning to have to deal with and will only get more traction as in the coming years. And so I basically want to cover three very broad points. First is talk about the critical skills gaps that we see in the federal government, using the GAO high risk list as kind of the evidence base for that. Second is talk about going forward, based on the governance challenges that agencies are now facing, what are some cross-cutting as we look across all agencies, capacities that they're going to need, human capital capacities, in order to respond to those governance challenges. And then third, just suggest some ways out of this. And obviously, our colleagues that are on the panel are the substantive experts that are really going to be able to tell us how we can work our way through some of these issues. So what I'm going to do is just touch on a number of illustrative areas, I hope, going forward. First, though, and just to underscore what Terry was saying about the centrality of the role of people in all of our organizations, and obviously that you all are the last people that I need to try and make a case for that. But the people policies of any organization, certainly at the federal government, have to be at the center of everything that we're doing in the way we think about delivering services and results for the American people. In most of our agencies, or I should say at least in many of our agencies, the people costs, salaries and expenses are the largest cost drivers within the budget. Within GAO, it's about 70 to 80% of our budget. And so when we talk about people being our most important asset, it's a big line item. Second is that, and more important, is that people are our most important asset from the standpoint of they drive our capacity to perform. They're the resonance. It's where all of our knowledge is. I have a colleague that is internationally that puts it that the great challenge that managers face is that their most important asset walks out the door every evening, and the challenge is to create an environment in which they're willing to walk back in the next morning. And so that's kind of the leadership challenge, but people are our most important asset. And then third, the reason that we need to be focusing on people is that, as was mentioned by Terry in her introductions, as we're going through big changes, your people strategies have to be the centerpiece of any serious change management strategy that we're going to be putting in place. And so for cost reasons, capacity reasons, and change management reasons, we all need to be focusing on our people aspects within agencies. However, having said that, obviously, is that many of the agencies do face a number of critical skills gaps that they have to work their way out of. And let me, again, put this in the context of the GAO high-risk list. Since 2000, we've had a high-risk program within GAO. And what it does is it focused, at least initially in the early years, just on those programs that were subject to waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement. And over time, it evolved to also include programs that we see where there's a fundamental deficiency in terms of mission performance, so didn't necessarily deal with that the root cause being a waste or a fraud or a waste or a fraud issue associated with that. And so now that we issue that every 2 years with each new Congress, and we're pleased that Congress uses that in order to help craft its oversight agenda. Progress on the high-risk list over the last dozen or so, 13 years, there's been about $350 billion in financial accomplishments associated with that. And so, agencies are taking the list very seriously and looking to come off in a very dedicated way. Having said that, though, when you look across the 35 areas that are currently on the high-risk list, 16 of them have a critical skills gap as among the root causes of the problem that they face. And another one, a 17th, is government-wide human capital issues, which is where OPM is the focus of the issues. So 17 of the 35, the focus is on critical skills gap as a root cause that's undermining mission performance within agencies. And none of these are going to be particularly new. In fact, there's a chart within the report that if you're interested in that goes through each of these, and then each of the various high-risk areas elaborates that in more detail. But just to touch on some of them, a couple of those high-risk areas where we're seeing a critical skills gap are going to be kind of immediately evident in cyber issues that kind of obtaining, retaining, training, developing the staff that's needed in order to deal with the evolving threat of the evolving cyber threat is a big challenge for federal agencies. Likewise, IT skills and acquisitions and maintenance is among the government-wide high-risk human capital critical skills shortages that we see. We also see those that are agency-specific, and some of them are, the colleagues up here on the next panel will certainly be talking about those, but just to touch on a couple. The Census Bureau, obviously we're going to be taking the census next April. The Census Bureau has an over 800 million, almost 900 million IT project that's going to be in place in order to manage the census, and it suffers from critical skills gaps in terms of the people that can oversee all that big contract. And obviously with the census, it's a once-a-decade opportunity, and if it doesn't go right the first time, you're in big trouble, and you just can't say, okay, we'll kind of slow things down and we'll take the census in October rather than April. That's not the way it works. And so it's got to be done exactly right, and it's got to, let's touch wood, it won't be done then. It's got to be done exactly right and only once, and so that's the big challenge that they face. In terms of Veterans Health Administration, they have persistent shortages that we have found in community care and medical support assistance that are undermining the medical support that they're able to give to our veterans. Federal disabilities programs, which is another area on the high-risk list. Social Security Administration, we have found needs greater capacity to deal with the appeals backlogs that they face. And VA needs additional staff to have the skills to update the disability eligibility criteria that takes place, that needs to be updated continuously. Within the Indian Health Service, they basically lack, and none of this is, again, new to these agencies, and so I don't want to imply that I'm telling them something that they don't know, but they lack critical skills gaps or they have critical skills gaps across a whole range of medical professionals and physicians and dentists and pharmacists and nurses and midwives and just everything that they need. It's very hard for them to get the skills that they need. Again, when you look at 16 of the high-risk areas, of the 35 high-risk areas, with government-wide being the 17th, you see a lack of human capital capability of being among the root causes that's undermining mission performance with these agencies. And so that's the big challenge that the agencies face now. Going forward, however, what I want to suggest is that there's a set of governance challenges that we all face, irrespective of what agency we're in or what program that we're managing, where we're going to need to make sure that we have the people that are capable of employing or responding to those governance challenges. And I realize that sounds kind of jargony, but to put it in a little bit more context, is that as we all know, any meaningful outcome that we're seeking to achieve is not going to be achieved by one program or one agency operating in isolation from everyone else. Rather, increasingly, it results, and certainly any meaningful results that we want to achieve, are going to be achieved by networks and organizations working across organizational boundaries, certainly at the federal level, very often with different sectors, with different levels of government, using increasingly complex public policy tools in order to achieve these results. If that accurately describes the kind of governance environment that we're in now, and increasingly the one that we're going to be operating in, and I think it does, or at least all the evidence that I've seen suggests that it does, then what that means is that we need to make sure that we have the people that can respond to that. In other words, we need to make sure that our human capital policies and programs and approaches evolve in tandem with the complexity of the types of issues and the governance responses we're taking to those issues. And let me elaborate on just a couple of areas where we see those as the types of governance challenges that we see and the skills then that we need to respond to that. First, as I've already alluded to, is just the cross-cutting nature of the programs. Is that we need to make sure that we have people that are very comfortable in working in horizontal collaboration, vertical collaboration across levels of government, and involving stakeholders and civil society organizations. One of the great things is that we were able to do a number of years ago, working with the Senior Executives Association, is that we reached out to them and they were identified for us some very recent Presidential Rank Award winners that had gotten their Presidential Rank Award in part based on an outcome that they had delivered through a collaborative enterprise. And we focus grouped with these individuals, and it was just an incredible opportunity to hear their stories and learn from them about what they were doing. But one of the things that they made very clear to us is that the types of technical skills the types of programmatic skills that got them to in a sense, where they were, that got them successful or high up on the organizational pyramid, were not the types of skills that they needed to be successful in managing the collaborative enterprise. And so increasingly what they found, they said, was they needed skills in what's been called, in network management or facilitation, in negotiation, in working with people from different cultures, with different organizational mindsets, with, as one person put it to me, is that it's relatively easy to get someone that works for you. The whole notion, remember this we used to talk about direct reports. How many direct reports do you have? I remember years ago when that was kind of the notion of organizational importance as to how many direct reports someone had. But they said if it's relatively easy to get someone that works for you to do what you want them to do. You, in a sense, kind of tell them, right? And then you give them feedback and all that. It's a completely different set of challenges to get someone who doesn't work for you, who's already tapped at 110%, has a different set of stakeholders, a different set, if they're in the private sector, a set of fiduciary responsibilities that are different from the public service responsibilities that we have in government, different levels of different political leadership. It's very, very difficult to get them to do, in a sense, what you need them to do. And that's a different skill set that has that happen. That's that facilitation, negotiation that takes place. So one set of skills is just making sure that we're comfortable in working in networked environments. Second is being able to be comfortable in using and overseeing increasingly complex public policy tools. And any of these can, the one that I spend a lot of time thinking about is public-private partnerships. And at the federal level, we're not as far as advanced in using them perhaps as certainly as many other countries where I spend a lot of time overseas, that is in many cases a predominant public service model on how services are delivered. But at the federal level, we're seeing the use of public-private partnerships to be increasingly frequent. Obviously at the state and even more so the local level, they're used an awful lot. If you spend a few minutes and kind of Google public-private partnerships, certainly here in the United States, you'll see at best it has a very unequal or uneven rather record of success. And among the reasons for that is that, kind of the knee-jerk reaction on this is, the government's always getting ripped off by the private sector. I mean, that would be the easy answer if that was the case. Unfortunately, that's not. What very often happens is that government does not have the sophistication that it needs in order to oversee and manage and work these contracts, these very complex contracting vehicles in a way that delivers results for the American people. And that's precisely the story that David Van Slyke, who's a Napa Fellow, and his colleagues told in their book about the Coast Guard's Deepwater program, which wasn't precisely a public-private partnership, but was a complex acquisition, and why that went, in a sense, off the rails, not because anyone was doing anything wrong or ripping anyone off, it was just because of the lack of ability in order to manage a very complex vehicle. As a colleague put it, is that the risk the government runs is that we contract out our brain, and making sure that that's not contracted out and how we can use these very complex vehicles is vital. Les Solomon, in his book Tools of Governance, I think, whatever. Les Solomon referred to this as the skills that we need in orchestration at the federal level. And that is using a variety of different public policy approaches, bringing them together in a sense of policy coherence in order to make sure that we're achieving meaningful results. The second key kind of capacity that we need going forward is to making sure that we're able to foster innovation and drive change increasingly through technology, but not exclusively through technology. Many of the organizations and many of the patterns and ways of doing business we're seeing are not fit for purpose, certainly for today, and will not be in the future. We need to make sure that we have people that are comfortable with the skills of change management and identifying the root cause problems within, or opportunities for improvements within agencies, root causes of the limitations of performance within organizations, and then making those changes both in a technical and in a human capital, facilitating the organizations to adjust and make the changes that are needed. Third is that we need people with skills and data and evidence to drive, to improve performance. We did some work with the chief performance officers in agencies a couple of years ago, or now a number of years ago, and interviewed each of those in the largest agencies, and asked them, well, what's the big skill gap that you see, or if any, within your operation? And the CPOs at that point told us is that the challenge that they saw was people that knew how to use evidence in order to identify a problem and then identify a solution to that. They said we're real good in kind of gathering evidence and talking about stories and seeing, even identifying, the difference between where we are and where we want to be. We're less good in making sure that we then identify, well, what do we do with that? What's the new direction in which we want to go? That's another skill that we need to make sure that we develop at the federal level and apply consistently across government. We need to make sure that we're managing the systemic risk of organizations. We know that, from A123, OMB Circular A123, OMB Circular A11, there's a much greater focus now, and it's a very positive, it's good to see, much greater focus in agencies in managing their enterprise risks. We still, when we go into agencies and talk to some of the chief risk officers or talk to the committees that are kind of managing risk, one of the things that they tell us is that in many cases it's still rudimentary. They're still getting comfortable with both the tools and techniques of risk management and the culture that needs to be put in place in order to manage risk and to have people feel comfortable in raising problems up without a kill the messenger type of philosophy. And so one of the things that we need to do, one of the skill sets that we need to make sure that we have in government is make sure that we have people that know how to manage risk, know how to identify risk, know how to put cultures in place in which people are going to be comfortable in talking about that risk. And remember, within the language of ERM, risk just merely means uncertainty, so you can kind of you can have positive risk. And so it means, how you think of identifying opportunities, especially in this networked environment that I mentioned just a few moments ago. Many of the risks that agencies face aren't going to be within the four walls of the agency. Rather, they're going to be within long delivery chains, and they're going to have to make sure that they have transparency over the risk of their delivery partners. Not that they own that risk, but to make sure that it's being effectively managed by those delivery partners. We need to make sure, and then finally, there's a long list that one could give of the types of skills that are needed, but I would just suggest, one more, is that we need to make sure that we have the skills and how to employ strategies for civic engagement in open government. Increasingly through, and it's I think that through the citizen science initiatives is where and the challenges that are out there is where government, at least at the federal level, is getting more and more comfortable in opening up governmental processes, inviting citizens in separate from or in addition to electoral process, voting. But there's just an enormous opportunity that we're seeing here, and that agencies that have been using some of these approaches, and it's not going to be appropriate for every type of program or every type of policy issue that we confront, but agencies that have been using these have been telling us that this is a new way of thinking and a new way of engaging citizens, and it has both to help government achieve its immediate purposes, and then obviously has a secondary effect, if it's done correctly, of increasing citizen trust in government. But these types of skills, in order to pull off one of these, in order to manage a civic engagement approach, is not something that's in a sense automatic, or it's not something that people just wake up one day and say, I think I'm going to put in place a big civic engagement strategy, and I'm going to get a bunch of people together. And if you do that, you're going to end up with one of the town halls that we saw a number of years ago, where there's a kind of a brilliant version of that on Parks and Recreation that's just hysterical of how it can go totally wrong. But being able to both manage one of those, and I'm talking about things far more sophisticated than just town halls, but how to manage those, how to get output out of those, how to sustain them, how to close them down once they're done, how to feed back to the people that have participated in it the value, if any, that they would have seen by that. All right, let me then now conclude with a couple of remarks on how we work our way out of this, because we talked about kind of some agency-specific ones that we're seeing now from the high-risk list, some capacities that at least from our work is suggesting that we're going to need going forward based on the kind of the governance approaches that agencies are using. So how do we work our way out of this? Well, the first, and I'm sorry, Tara, that I just keep repeating, or just alluding back to what you were saying, is that we have to make sure that we link our human capital strategies to our strategic plans. That's of course a truism, and we all know that. But what I want to suggest by that is that we have to make sure that we're also looking longer term on this, and that we're making sure that we're thinking about what are the knowledge and skills and abilities that we're going to need not just today, but what are we going to need in order to be successful 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. And then let's start putting in the hiring strategies, the development strategies that are going to get us there. And one very specific area where that can play out is in succession planning. we did some an analysis several years ago in which we tried to identify or went around the world looking at good practice in strategic planning. And one of the things that we saw is all organizations do what's very often referred to as position-based strategic planning. It also goes through the very inelegant name of truck-sensitive strategic planning, right? It's the notion of if a truck hits someone, who's next in line for that position, and kind of everyone does that, and in fact with CDC, I believe things says in the context of pandemics, you need to be thinking 3 deep for every position and something. So that's all good, and that has to be done. Not the truck-sensitive part, but I mean that people are going to retire, people are going to move on. You want to at least have a sense of what's going to be, who's next in line. The best organizations, though, supplement that, and they supplement that with they supplement a position-based version of succession planning with a much more competency-based. And that competency is not a current competency, but where do we need to be in the future? And thinking about what's the possible range of businesses, as it were, that it could be in, or ways that we can be delivering results in the future. Let's start hiring and training and developing on those now. And so that's why things at the federal level, like the President Management Fellows Program and the issues that are associated with that, and the intern program and the issues that are associated with that, is so concerning. Because we need to make sure that we're bringing people in, and we're bringing them in order to develop them to be the leaders of the next generation. Because if all we're doing is the position-based approach, our implicit assumption with that is that the key to our future success is to be more like we are today, is to keep perfecting the model, is to keep reproducing exactly what we are. And if there are very few agencies or organizations, I would suggest, that's going to be the key to their future success, to perfect what they're doing today. Increasingly, success is going to be thinking in new and more creative ways, and that's the link that has to take place between the human capital approaches, the human capital planning, and the outcomes and the mission outcomes that we need to achieve. So it's a link between strategic planning, strategic foresight, and human capital planning. They need to come together within organizations. If they're in different silos, that's very often that's going to take us in a bad direction. Second on that, and now let me just conclude with one other thing on kind of development programs is that we've gone through and done a lot of analysis of the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey and trying to look at the questions that are most directly related to improvements in employee engagement. And through the obvious kind of complex statistical analysis, we've been able to narrow it down to 6 or so different questions. One of which is and this is the key to it, a key to improving employee engagement was the question in which my supervisors talk to me about training and development or provide me opportunities for training and development within the organization. And so it's not only good for immediate mission or longer term mission, it's also good for immediate mission in which it links the person to the organization, in which they're going to be more engaged today if we provide them with opportunities for training and development to build their capacities for tomorrow and beyond. And so that's a key part of a key secondary benefit to employee engagement, or rather to development programs. Finally, let me just then conclude on kind of some government-wide capacities that we need to have. As you know, that OPM there's debate about OPM and reorganization and all the rest, and that the president has made a proposal in that regard. And I'm not going to get into kind of what the aspects of that, because that's a policy call that certainly GAO doesn't have a particular position on as to whether or not you keep it together or blow it up or send it all around to different agencies or whatever the case may be. What I will say, what we have alerted to the Congress and the administration on, though, is that irrespective of what sort of organizational arrangement that we use, there's a set of cross-cutting government-wide capacities that need to be put in place and need to be maintained. Whatever institutional arrangement that you use. Now, some of these obviously are protection from merit system protections and protections against prohibited personnel practices, but some of these are also a foresight capability, the capability to identify system-wide solutions to exactly the types of issues that we're going to be talking about in just a moment on the panel, to be able to get collaboration across across agencies. That needs to be in place irrespective of what sort of organizational arrangement that we have. And so let me end on that because I see I'm about to get the hook from the back. But again, thank the Academy and Management Concepts very much for the opportunity to just share some views on that. Thank you.